This event is co-sponsored at AUB by the Center for American Studies and Research, the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, the Issam Faris Institute, the Arts and Humanities Initiative, the Said-Makdisi Program in Literature, the Department of English, and the Office of the Provost. This lineup of centers, programs, departments bears testimony in itself at AUB to the impact of Edward Said on several academic disciplines and intellectual endeavors. An outstanding academic representative of post-structuralism, an articulate humanist in defending the Palestinian cause, an anti-authoritarian thinker, opera critic, pianist, television celebrity, essayist, public orator, Edward Said eludes classification. He exposed connections between European Enlightenment and colonialism and grounded the critique of oppression through scholarly discourse. He retained refined appreciations of the literary traditions he criticized and did not readily dismiss their intrinsic cultural integrity. In this, he transcended ideology and relativism. Holding today's event in his memory is not simply an act of remembrance, since his thought remains with us, and rarely would we pass on this campus without myself hearing his name mentioned, his oeuvre evoked. I have been granted the privilege of moderating today's panel. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to make their presentation, to be followed at the end by discussions among the panelists and with the audience. I hope you will bear with me should I insist that we abide by this time frame. And we give the first presentation to Jean Said-Makdisi, writer, researcher, former professor of English and cultural studies at BUC, now named LA. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank AUB and all those who participated in creating this memorialist salute to Edward, and of course to those who are participating in the salute. It's very difficult to believe that it's been 10 years since Edward died. 7 years since my sister died, who died of a similar disease to Edward, and so really a hard time to remember. Many years ago, I think it was the last time he addressed the Lebanese audience here in Beirut, something happened that woke me up with a jolt. He was talking at the Issam Faris Hall, and it was jam-packed with people. There were people sitting on the stairs, there were people standing outside, I think they had screens or at least radio thing outside the hall. And as I was sitting in the audience and looking around, minding my own business, suddenly I heard a great commotion in the back, and I looked around and I saw, to my astonishment, that the audience had risen, and spontaneously risen to its feet, and was greeting Edward with a hugely enthusiastic standing ovation, which lasted well after he had taken his place on the podium. He had to struggle his way down to the platform. And of course, the applause just went on and on. Of course, I joined in the applause. I was deeply moved. I was rather sad. I knew how sick he was. And I was immensely proud. But I was also deeply puzzled. What was it about Edward that made him the subject of such adoration and adulation, surely more suitable for a national hero than a literary and intellectual figure, however much a giant in his field? And which nation are we talking about? Of course, Palestine, yes, but there were lots of Palestinians in the hall, and I'm sure they were among the very enthusiastic. But there were lots of Lebanese. Of course, the majority were Lebanese. I could see there were Africans, there were Indians, there were Europeans, there were Americans. There were all kinds of people in that hall. I recognized it was a motley crowd in other ways as well. There were young people and old people. There were university professors and students. There were writers, ambassadors, bankers, journalists, novelists, a great many very well-dressed people of the bourgeois class as well, I must say. And while I knew that a large number of people had read and taught Edward and knew his work very well, I knew that some people had only read maybe his newspaper articles. I also knew that there were people who had never read a word Edward had written. It's true. I was sitting once in one of his previous lectures, in fact, the time when he was giving his talk on the 25th anniversary of Orientalism, which piece ended up in the revised edition of Orientalism. He gave a talk here that ended up in the book. I was sitting next to a lady of my acquaintance, a very nice lady, but she was obviously not in the least bit interested in what he had to say. So she was fiddling and rustling papers and moving around, and I was going to smack her at one point, stop doing this. But in the end, of course, when the applause came, she stood up and she was as enthusiastic as anyone else. So what was it then that made him so adored, if I can, that's maybe the wrong word, but I also know that there were a lot of people who hated Edward. There's some here and many in America and in other places. We know that as well. The kind of applause he had that particular day was the kind that one had seen for Abdel Nasser, for Fidel Castro, for that kind of political figure rather than a purely intellectual one. I thought about it a lot, and I thought, well, for one thing, his appearance fit the role. I needn't remind anyone here that Edward was a very handsome man, with enormous presence and charm. I don't want to sound stupid or superficial about this. I think it's a very important point, really. After all, the ancient heroes, the ancient epic heroes were all beautiful men. Even the modern epic heroes like James Bond is a very beautiful man. I think Arabs have so often been represented in the West as nasty, ugly, vicious, fanatical, brutal people. I remember with deep anger those loathsome caricatures that dominated American newspapers in 1967, that they loved being represented by a man as good-looking as he was, with a sharp intellect, a noble message, and an authoritative bearing. For many had surely chosen him as their representative over some of the less beautiful political leaders and spokesmen of our time. Of course, there was much, much more to him than his good looks. If the great national poet Mahmoud Darwish spoke for his people of their feelings, put their feelings into words, Edward had the ability to talk back to the empire on their behalf with total authority and fearlessness. Very unusually for people of his generation. I'd like to remind everyone that had Edward lived, he would be now approaching his 78th birthday. So he belonged to a certain generation, but in spite of, there was not a hint of the colonized sycophant or the man who, quote unquote, knew his place in his approach to those in power in the West, whether fellow academics, journalists, or politicians. Don't forget that he and a few others of his age, I don't mean to exaggerate his importance, because of course there were others as well, with whom he often collaborated, paved the way for scholars of the younger generation, such as those at on this table and others in the hall, for the younger generations to do the same. I think he and his successors taught them his fearlessness and his refusal to bow as an underling, and made it easier for the young people to do the same. His intellectual duels with the likes of Abba Iban and Bernard Lewis and many others, of course, are classics of argumentation and triumphs of irony and sarcasm. If anything, he seemed sometimes to outdo their arrogance with his own, making it clear to them that they had better watch their step and certainly watch their words when he was around. Perhaps this, more than anything else, made people here look up to him. Their own sense of fear, their overwhelming sense of incompetence and even impotence in the face of those he used angrily to refer to as the great white fathers, made them admire, perhaps sometimes envy, his standing, unflinching, face to face with the enemy. And here, of course, I don't mean a national enemy. Edward would not have tolerated such a narrow thought, but the enemy of justice, of human decency and honesty, the arrogant, heartless, prejudiced racists, not just in the academy, but also in public life, as much in this part of the world as anywhere else. I have no doubt that it was especially his virtuosic use of the English language that gave him the authority to speak as he did. I'm not sure how many people of the thousands who have written about him understood the source of this virtuosity. Of course, he had a natural talent with languages, and he had a terrific sense of humor. I can't emphasize that enough. I think, by the way, in the huge amount that has been written about him, another thing which has been left out is very little writing about his wit, his sarcasm, his irony, and above all, his notion of satire. We had many talks, Edward and I, about Jonathan Swift, whom he had admired enormously. All of them required a deep sense of humor. And this was part of his arsenal of linguistic and cultural weapons. I don't know how many of you were ever in such a situation with Edward as to become a victim of his humor. He one time called a relation of ours in Washington, D.C., put on a very, very strict Indian accent, Vijay, caricaturish Indian accent, and told her he was calling on behalf of the Indian embassy because her hostessing was so famous. He would like to invite her on a tour of India and show off her skills as a hostess. She fell for it hook, line, and sinker. And yes, I'll be happy to go whenever you want, and it's fine, and And then at the end of the thing, when he finally told her who he was, she said, I knew it was you, Edward, all along. She was a good sport. I would have killed him had he done it to me. And of course, he did do it to me many times. The same wicked humor that served him so well in his public debates with Zionists, unrepentant imperialists, and incompetent academics, he applied in the family with relentless frequency. One time, my mother and I went to visit my sister who lived in Geneva. And Edward happened to be in Geneva at the same time he was attending a meeting of some sort. And we went in the morning to have coffee with him in his hotel. And at the end of it, we were standing outside ready to go home. He had to go to his meeting. And my mother said, in a haze, how shall we go home? We could see Joyce's house across the lake from where we were. So Edward immediately pounced on her. How are you going to go home? I'll get you the water skis, he said. Or how about you can swim, and do you need your bouées? And he went on and on and on. And of course, my mother was in stitches, as were Joyce and I. However, the moment we got into the taxi to go home and said goodbye to Edward, my mother burst into tears and turned on Joyce and I, very angry. Am tithaku alayhi, she said. Edward made her laugh. We made her cry. It was typical, of course. Let me tell you something. Those of you who have read his memoir, you know, Edward presented himself as a bit of a victim. Trust me when I tell you. He got away with murder in our family. The only one of us who ever got the better of him was my son, Osama. Some of you know him, many of you know him. Osama was maybe 10, 11 years old when Edward started teasing him with his name. So, I Sama, you Sama, we Sama, they Sama, he said. And Osama was very annoyed with this. And then finally he turned on Edward, pulled himself up, turned on Edward and said, hello, Big Eddie. Edward loathed the name Ed. Or Eddie. He loathed it. So Osama's response was really a big blow to him. But let me get back to language and Edward's dazzling use of it, the English language. I think the primary influence on our family's experience in English was our parents' absolute insistence on church going every Sunday of our lives, supplemented by the rigorous morning assemblies at our British colonial schools, which also taught us the same English. By the same teacher in the same way as it would have been taught in England. Now, we've all blasted them for their colonial attitudes and for their lording their culture over ours and so on. But there's no question that the deep sonorities, the rhythm, and the melodic turns of the English language, as we absorbed it through the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican hymnal, the works of Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, Swift, Dickens, Jane Austen, and all the other masters of the English language, formed our daily intellectual bread, and surely influenced Edward and helped to hone and refine his natural linguistic ability. The use of French by the Egyptian upper classes too, whose children, many of them were in school with us, especially, and our parents' friends in the Shawam community of Egypt, which you probably know is later refined and augmented by his work at Princeton and Harvard, and of course Paris, where he also studied. His French was impeccable, and his accent had nothing of the vestiges of his American or Arab upbringing. All of this added to the sense of power that he exuded in his various intellectual sparrings. It is, of course, part of my personal view of Edward that I saw him always as an overwhelmingly powerful figure. This is natural. He was not only my older brother, but the oldest in the family, and the only boy. I think my sisters grew up in great awe of him, an awe that lasted, well, it still exists, I suppose. Those of you who have studied sibling relations must know that. But it is also partly the feminist in me that recognizes the power of the mature male as he wends his way through and in society. I'm not just referring here to physical power, though of course there's that, but the power of authority, of experience, and of worldliness. Edward studied at, as I suppose you all know, Victoria College in Cairo, and then Princeton, Harvard. Before that, he went to a very famous private school in America, Mount Hermon. And many of his friends in these schools and universities became part of the American power structure later on. This sort of experience led my son, Sari, to raise a question at a conference held here many years ago. If Edward had written every word he wrote and said everything he ever said on those famous public debates, if he had played the piano as beautifully as he did and tennis and squash as well, had he been as articulate as he was, but had he been teaching not at Columbia University, but at the University of Karachi, Cairo University, Bir Zayed, Lebanese University, AUB, would he have been granted the kind of attention he was? Had he been a product of a third world university, far from the center of world power, would he have had the same universal audience as he had from his position within the American power structure? Who can know? In any case, in his later years, though he lost none of his power, a growing and insidious vulnerability invaded his presence. This was, of course, partly due to his illness. The shadow of death hung over him, and it was impossible not to recognize it. And I remind you that the ancient heroes, too, always were in constant touch with mortality and death, especially our own Gilgamesh. He became thinner and thinner and more tired. His famous curly black hair grayed and thinned out with one chemo after another. Perhaps it was this sense of his vulnerability that led to another phenomenon which has always struck me as strange. I have often been struck at how many people who had no personal relationship whatsoever with him, who never met him, talked to me about him, calling him Edward. Not Dr. Said or Professor Said or any of that, but just Edward. I was very struck by that. It is a bit odd, isn't it? Maybe it isn't, I don't know. His love of music, of course, was famous, and I'm going to leave out a lot of this stuff. I just want to say that music was at the core of his being, and it was there that I first understood and saw that he was slipping away from us. I was in New York a year or two before he died, while Salim Ibrahimi, Lakhda's son, was making a film on Edward for Al Jazeera. One afternoon, they were to film his playing a four-hand piece of music with a friend of his at Columbia, who lived down the street from his house. We walked over down Riverside Drive in a procession, Edward and I, Salim, the photographers, the film crew. Edward was dressed with his usual elegance, and if you did not know he was sick, you might not have perceived anything. I thought he was looking particularly well that day, and he seemed quite chipper. They sat down at the piano and started to play the tender and melancholic opening of Schubert's F minor Fantasia, which I'm sure you all know. As the moments passed, Edward started to make mistakes. He knew the piece quite well. I'd heard him play it before many times. He played it once at a benefit performance with the Lebanese pianist Diana Ta'idin. And that morning, he had been practicing it at home. But the mistakes he were making were not mistakes, were not simple mistakes. I was overwhelmed with the knowledge that he was losing control. Much later, just a few days before he died, I was talking with him on the phone and noticed that he was losing control over his words. I'm finishing. Using one when he meant another. This was Edward Said, losing control over the English language. I knew at once that the end was near, and immediately made my plan to go to New York. He died while I was on my flight. I have no doubt that Edward would have lived longer had he not always been fighting the battles he had to fight. I'm not going to tell the story which I had planned to do on the congressional hearings on the Title VI. Where's Alex? Vijay, you know Alex, I'm sure. Those of you who know about it, the Title VI hearings in the Congress was a direct attack on him. I happened to speak to him one day, and he was furious, and he was so tired. He just sounded so exhausted by this thing. Here they are attacking me in the Congress, and I have no right to be there. I can't respond. It was a kind of powerlessness that he felt when he was under this massive attack, which legally left him out. To be in control must have been exhausting. And I think he was worn out, not just by his sickness or his enormously hard work, but the endless battle for justice in the world, which he was fighting. Thank you.
And with the gathering that is motivated originally by scholarship. We have all touched that, so I want to actually share so, the next speaker is Elias Khoury, novelist, playwright, critic, and publisher.
مرحبا. Actually, I thought about what can I say, and then found nothing except to write a personal letter to Edward Said. So forgive me if I will share this letter with you.
We can't.
Louder.
We cannot hear you well.
Letter to Edward Said. Are you hearing me now? Yes. Dear friend, let us begin from the end, as we say in our spoken Arabic. I know that you are always in a hurry and you don't like introductions. So let's go directly to the issue. Although the issue is perplexed and ambiguous. To make a long story short, I want to confess that there is a problem in communicating with you. I know how the dead can speak to the living, but I don't know how we can speak to them. To tell you the truth, this question haunts me deeply since the death of 3 of my friends. You died in 2003, Samir Qasir was assassinated in 2005, and Mahmoud Darwish died in 2008. I never thought before that death has the taste of a crime, as Al-Mutanabbi formulated it eloquently. إذا تأملت الزمان وصرفه تيقنت أن الموت ضرب من القتل. I will not translate, but the meaning in the second part says, I became sure that death is a form of killing. The death of the 3 of you gave me the bitter feeling that there is a kind of injustice in the just and necessary assumption of death itself. The assassination of Samir Qasir was a token to the bloody price of the unachieved promises of the Arab Spring. But you and Mahmoud died in an ordinary death. I'm not sure that we can use the word ordinary to describe something that is unbelievably believed to be the destiny of man. Yet I want to confess to you in front of your friends who are gathered here to commemorate 10 years of your absence, that the death of the 3 of you created a big personal problem to me. Samir is my younger brother, Mahmoud is my personal poet, and you are my intellectual and hero. I always believed and I have discussed this with you in one of our conversations, that literature is the only place where the dead and the living can communicate. And this is why there is always a kind of a deep contradiction between religion and literature. This contradiction reflected itself in a clear way and more than anywhere else in the classical Arabic poetry. The issue today is not this contradiction that, as one can notice, is taking new dimensions and aspects in our Arab life. The issue is this common field where the dead and the living can communicate. It's clear to everyone that the dead can speak to us through their works. When I miss you, I know how to hear your voice. I go to one of your books and feel how your presence is still present, and how your words speak to us and opens the ways of rationality and critical thought. In these moments, I feel that you are the present absent par excellence. The Israelis thought that their colonial intelligence led them to coin the term present absent to name the Palestinians who became strangers in their own country. But they never realized that naming their victims in this way will make from the Palestinians the Jews of the Jews, where you, the Palestinian, Edward Said, will become, as you have put it yourself, the last Jewish intellectual and also the major theoretician of exile. How can I speak to you and hear your comments? I know that I will not find an answer to this question unless I consider your death as a metaphor of life itself. And in this case, I want to discuss with you two major issues related to your hypothesis about the exile and the representations of the intellectual. The two issues are intertwined in the process of the development of your theory. You gave exile a special place in the intellectual life, and you made from two exiled intellectuals, Adorno and Urbach, a model of how the intellectual must behave as an independent critical voice. Your analysis of the exile made from you, as Amnon Raz Karkotskin put it in his article, Exile and Binationalism, from Sholem and Arendt to Said and Darwish, the new voice of exile as an existential situation. And his assumption was that the Palestinian intellectuals are now the voice of exile after the systematic destruction by the Israeli establishment of the concept of galot, or exile, in the Jewish culture. My question is about a new type of exile that is becoming more and more dominant in the Arab world, and which needs to be discussed with a fresh approach. My assumption is that the intellectual of the Arab Mashriq is becoming in exile in his own country. How dare I say this in the midst of the Arab Spring and after major uprisings that enabled the people, at least in Tunisia and Egypt, to overthrow two despotic regimes. This is paradoxical, one can say, but this is our feeling now, where the revolutionary process is taking violent shapes, especially with the continuing bloodshed in Syria. Is this our destiny to feel that we have to choose between different forms of despotism, the military or the fundamentalists, or it is our fault? Most probably it's our fault, but admitting this cannot alone solve the problem. The problem must take us to analyze the structure of our cultural life and to begin from the criticism of the alliance between the military and parts of the intellectual elites under the banner of facing Islamism. This led to a real isolation of the voice of the secular intellectuals, which reflected itself in their minor role in the Arab uprisings. The interior exile is becoming a heavy burden after the destruction of the secular political parties and the trade unions during decades of dictatorships. This is the new exile that you are facing. I'm sure that you know what I mean. The Palestinian people and its writers and intellectuals are still going through this experience inside Palestine 48. And this type of exile in their land and not outside it played a major role in recreating the Palestinian culture after the war of the Nakba of 1948. And unfortunately, it seems that the interior exile in Bilad al-Sham is becoming the major form of exile, here and now, in Beirut and Damascus, and Nazareth and Jerusalem. The intellectuals are going through the experience of exile inside their countries. They don't have the privileges of exile, but they have all its disadvantages, and they have to find a way to rebuild the bridge towards liberty and liberation. In your book, Representations of the Intellectual, you tried to draw a personal portrait through combining Gramsci's organic intellectual, who is actively involved in society, with Benda's cleric, whose activity is essentially not the pursuit of practical aims. This combination represents the first features of the intellectual of the 21st century. The model based on the statement of Zola's J'accuse that reached its peak with Sartre's universal intellectual will gradually disappear with Foucault's specific intellectual before it will be melted totally in the global market of ideas. For you, the intellectual, I quote, is an individual endowed with a faculty of representing, embodying, articulating a message, a view, an attitude, philosophy, or option to, as well as for a public. And this place has an edge to it and cannot be played without being someone whose place is publicly to raise embarrassing questions, to confront orthodoxy and dogma, rather than to produce them, to be someone who cannot easily be co-opted by governments or corporations. And his raison d'etre is to represent all those people and issues that are routinely forgotten or swept under the rug, end of quote. The synthesis of Gramsci and Benda, a Marxist philosopher and an idealist thinker whose models will go from Socrates to Jesus of Nazareth, was an attempt to face, in an oblique way, the crisis of the intellectual in our postmodern world, and mainly the crisis of the third world intellectual who feels total isolation both in her country and in the world. Your intellectual does not only use the three weapons of Joyce's young Stefan Dedalus, silence, exile, and cunning, but he is angry and active, a kind of a mirror to his author. Quote, there is no such thing as a private intellectual. Since the moment you set down words and then publish them, you have entered the public world. End of quote. My question, my dear friend, is not about the concept that can be developed to incorporate this new experience of interior exile. It's about the relationship between the birth of this new intellectual and this history that is unfolding us with blood and mud. How can we make from our interior exile a road towards the horizon of dignity, freedom, and liberation? In the end, I want to tell you that we are no more ready to follow your advice, that the intellectual must speak truth to power. Here, my dear friend, is the lesson that we learned from the long intellectual journey that began with Tahtawi in the beginning of the Arab Nahda. The dialogue with despotic, confessional, and mafia-type powers will lead only to the humiliation of culture and permits power to use it to cover its crimes. We have no common language with this type of political power, and we have nothing to tell them. To tell the truth to them, we need an ethical code that can be the reference of the civil society in its relationship with a political power that have destroyed this code by its own hands. Enough. A power that destroyed the state long time before the uprising began, as it is the case in Syria, a power that is making from the state from the state apparatus a game in the hands of the confessional warlords, as it is the situation in Lebanon, a colonial power that is making the Nakba a continuous process in the land of Palestine, or a Palestinian authority that is mute and unwilling to resist. We have nothing to say to these powers. The only thing to be done is to turn our backs to them and begin with the wretched of the earth, a new culture that can be a tool in the long search for freedom. You understand now, my dear friend, how much we need to speak to you and hear you in the midst of our search for the culture of change, and how much we miss you. Thank you.
The letter that more in my generation at least, it gives us some kind of hope for regaining our voice in the heart of disaster. Our next speaker is Fawwaz Traboulsi, an associate professor in science and history. He lectures at NTU and
I had prepared for 10 minutes, so you're going to hear Facebook type and sentences. Well, the Edward Said I know, the one who admires Tahiyya Karyoka and Sid Charis. I have a long conversation with him on this. The one who loves music, the one who threw stones at the Israeli soldier in Buwaybt al-Khatmi after the liberation of the South, is to me primarily a critic, a literary critic, passionate with the mechanism by which literature, the novel in particular, reveals and hides social relations and positions of power. On the other hand, I know of three Edward Saids. The first is the critic of Orientalism, a book written in 1978, and I should immediately add that this book has taken an independent life of its author and is increasingly being divorced of the development of its author. The second Edward Said is a critic of Occidentalism. The Edward Said who wrote Culture and Imperialism and who criticized the way national liberation movements saw colonialism, imperialism, and if you want, the West in general. Here you have the critic of nativism, of a certain kind of nationalism in which he was inspired by people like Fanon, and emphasized the fact that national consciousness, once liberation happens, should turn into social consciousness. The third Edward Said, on whom very few people talk, is the secular humanist, the Edward Said of the late style, who had long refuted the idea that the world is divided into two essences, East and West, not to speak of the fact that you have different areas which cannot be included in East and West, like Africa, Southern America, etc. And moved from geography to history by assimilating Vico and Marx. I would just want to emphasize the two messages of Edward, number 2 and number 3. They're hardly heard, hardly worked on, especially in our part of the world. What prevails is the deconstruction of discourses in Euro and America on Islam and the Arab world, rather than producing knowledge on Islam and the Arab world. In a nutshell, what I want to say is that Western Orientalist knowledge of power, definitely, knows enough on the region and on Islam to control, exploit, and maintain relations of domination and exploitation. The big question is the knowledge in the Arab world developed enough, critical enough, vigorous enough, comprehensive enough to guide towards the Arabs controlling their lives and destinies, achieving liberation, freedom, and social justice? That, to me, is the legacy of Edward Said. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Vijay, Prashad, the Edward Said Chair of American Studies at the
Thank you. Good afternoon. In 2000, the year after his friend, the Pakistani intellectual Iqbal Ahmed died, Edward Said wrote the foreword to a collection of Iqbal's interviews called Confronting Empire. In that foreword, Said wrote of Iqbal as our dear friend and comrade, and as a real friend in the struggle. Rarely do we talk in the same breath of friendship and intellectual production, of friendship and political camaraderie. For Said, a counter-systemic intellectual who worked inside the United States and was cut off from a counter-systemic political organization, it was the bonds of friendship and family along the east coast of the United States, in Beirut and on Lebanon's mountains and elsewhere, that sustained his activity. It was friendship for Said and for Iqbal Ahmed that nourished their lonely work. I am surrounded here by Said's friends. My remarks are in honor of Edward Said, a formidable example, but as well a great friend. Said turned frequently in his writings to the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci for an exploration of the role of the intellectual. Gramsci pointed to two commonly found kinds of intellectuals: traditional intellectuals like clerics and professors, whose social location identifies them as intellectuals regardless of the quality of their work. Doctor this, doctor that, hello doctor. And organic intellectuals, like engineers for factories and learned peasants for the countryside, who come out of their own class activity to become the ones who can help provide information to keep things running and speculations to help things develop. Neither the traditional nor the organic intellectuals are inherently conservative or radical. Athwart both categories runs a vein of counter-systemic thought and practice. There are some, often too many, college professors who are conservative, and there are some intellectuals of the countryside who are radical. Such intellectuals who are against the order of reality but are rooted in a mass political party have that organizational anchor to orient them. Gramsci called them the new intellectuals. They are neither merely traditional intellectuals nor organic intellectuals, but a breed apart, the cadre of a transformational political party. For Gramsci, members of a communist party. What defines these new intellectuals? They are those who throw themselves into active participation in practical life as constructor, organizer, permanent persuader. The scope for such political activity on the left in the United States had declined by the time Said became active, which is to say after the 1967 war. The drift rightward of the mainstream parties marooned intellectuals like Said on academic islands, a saving grace being the international nature of the Palestinian struggle, which allowed Said to link himself to its dynamism, but from afar. If you have the temperament of a new intellectual, but have no mass political party, and if you live in the land of capital, you are stalked by alienation and despondency. In this context, correspondence and friendship with like minds forms the basis of political resilience. Iqbal Ahmed was a friend in the struggle, not because he was charming and pleasant to be around, which he was, but mainly because he functioned as a caravanserai in a long chain of such places of revitalization. In his own lecture on intellectuals, Said noted that too much effort goes into a sociological definition of the intellectual and not enough on the image, the signature, the actual intervention and performance, the lifeblood of every real intellectual, what you were talking about earlier. I want to add that too little is given to the reproduction of the intellectual, to the depth of political friendships that sustain the solitary work of counter-systemic intellectuals who are not directly tied to political organizations. Said called Iqbal Ahmed my guru in political matters, but Iqbal often used similar phrases to refer to Said, as he did in his foreword to Said's The Pen and the Sword, 1994. There can be no lonelier task in the United States, indeed in the entire global north, than to keep alive the hopes of Palestinian self-determination and to defend the right of the Palestinian people to their national aspirations. In the opening to Orientalism, Said wrote, "The life of an Arab Palestinian in the West, particularly in America, is disheartening. The web of racism, cultural stereotypes, political imperialism, dehumanizing ideology holding in the Arab or the Muslim is very strong indeed. And it is this web which every Palestinian has come to feel as his unique punishing destiny." Iqbal and Edward, both born in the mid-1930s in lands colonized and then partitioned the next decade, both exiles from their places of birth, were united in their aspirations for Edward's people. It was the question of Palestine that brought the two of them to Beirut in 1980, where they met the great Pakistani poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who was then the editor of Lotus, the magazine of the Afro-Asian world. Faiz had taken refuge in Beirut from the military dictatorship led by Zia-ul-Haq. A previous regime had imprisoned Faiz between 1951 and 1955, so he knew what would happen if he remained in Pakistan. Faiz was himself not a member of the Communist Party, the reason for his 1950s incarceration, although his wife Alice was. He was nonetheless one of Gramsci's new intellectuals, using his perch as editor of a major newspaper to push progressive ideals, and his position as a man of letters to lead the Trade Union Congress and the Pakistan Peace Committee. In prison, Faiz wrote Daste Sabah, Fingers on the Wind, whose foreword encourages intellectuals to show the world the ocean in a drop of water. And then he said, "To be able to show this ocean to others depends upon his control over his art, and his ability to set in motion some new currents in the ocean depends upon the fire in his blood and the zeal of his passions. Success in all three tasks demands continuous toil and struggle." We have an echo here with Gramsci's new intellectuals, who are tasked with being constructors and organizers, participants in active life, and permanent persuaders. In Beirut, Faiz was cut off from the movement to which he had given his life, but he did not remain idle. The Palestinian struggle found him, and he gave his art to give it voice in the subcontinent. His book of poems from Beirut, Mere Dil, Mere Musafir, My Heart, My Traveler, published in 1981, was dedicated to Yasser Arafat. It is a restless book of poems filled with yearning, something Said recognized when they met the previous year. During one arak-soaked evening in 1980, Faiz recited some of these Beirut poems, which Iqbal translated for Edward. At some point, both Faiz and Edward asked Iqbal to stop. The two literary men saw that the radical had not the ear to do justice to the work. It was enough to hear Faiz. Tum mere paas raho, mere qatil, mere dildar, mere paas raho. Be near me, you who demolish me, you whom I love, be near me. It was that evening that inspired Said's The Mind of Winter, Reflections on Life in Exile, where he wrote of Faiz, "You could hear old and new together. His purity and precision were astounding. And you must imagine, therefore, a poet whose poetry combined the sensuousness of Yeats with the power of Neruda. He was, I think, one of the greatest poets of this century. The comparisons are apposite. Yeats was a member of the Irish Republican Army, Neruda of the Chilean Communist Party, and Faiz in the midst of the left movement in Pakistan. Their art was not subsumed by their organizational commitments. Rather, their linkages enhanced their hopes for the future and allowed them to dip their pens in the ink of suffering, knowing full well that their poems would help pave the way to a better horizon. Among those poems that Faiz had written in Beirut were Do Nazme Filastin Ke Liye, 2 poems for Palestine. One of these poems is a lullaby for Palestinian children. Mat ro bacche, ro ro ke abhi teri ammi ki aankh lagi hai. Don't cry, children. Your mother has just cried herself to sleep. Mat ro bacche, ro ro ke abhi teri ammi ki aankh lagi hai. Mat ro bacche, tere abba ne kuch hi pehle apne gham se rukhsat hi li hai. Don't cry, children. Your father has just left this world of sorrow. Mat ro bacche, tere abba ne kuch hi pehle apne gham se rukhsat li hai. And then, after many more stanzas, तू मुस्काएगा तो शायद ये सब एक दिन बेकदम पर तुझसे खेलने को लौट आएगा. Maybe if you smile, they'll one day return in a different guise to play with you. तू मुस्काएगा तो शायद ये सब एक दिन बेकदम पर तुझसे खेलने को लौट आएगा. The catalogue of suffering and rebellion is repetitive. It requires, as Said put it, constant work, said loudly enough, repetitively enough, and stridently enough. Faiz would eventually return to Pakistan to rekindle his political connections. Iqbal Ahmed would also return to Pakistan to try and found a university, Khaldunia, named for Ibn Khaldun, a project still in the works. But where could Edward Said return? His journey became lonelier, and his national aspirations seemed to be wasted by what he called the Palestinian Versailles, the Oslo Agreement. He had no mass political agency to give him succor. He had to remain in a public conversation too tin-eared and conservative to allow for his style of dissent. An immense amount of courage and the bonds of friendship provided the sustenance. Edward Said was a great intellectual and a powerful political figure, but he also had remarkable friends. Baki hai lahu dil se, to har ashk se paida, range laab aur rukhsar-e sanam karte rahenge. एक तर्ज़ तगाफुल है सो वो उनको मुबारक, एक अर्ज़ तमन्ना है सो हम करते रहेंगे. While blood remains in our veins, our tears will color our cheeks. They are welcome to their indifference. We will only submit our desires. बाकी है लहू दिल में तो हर अश्क से पैदा, रंगे लाब और रुखसरे सनम करते रहेंगे. एक तर्ज़ तगाफुल है सो वो उनको मुबारक, एक अर्ज़ तमन्ना है सो हम करते रहेंगे. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward Said, Chair, for singing this lullaby. It suited us in preparing our words. Our next speaker is Samir, Professor of English and Philosophy.
Thank you, Nader. Can you hear me in the back?
No.
You can't hear me, and you're half a meter away. Is this better? Okay. In this presentation, I will zoom in on Edward in 3 capacities: as a family friend, as a teacher, and as a thesis advisor. In so doing, I hope ultimately to shed light on Edward as a man. Edward as a family friend. While growing up in Beirut, I saw Edward at our home on several occasions. Soon enough, he was much more than one of my late father's closest friends. He had become a household name in connection with the little I knew at the time about art, music, literature, and politics. I was very lucky to have met him long before I joined Columbia University's master's program in the fall of 1986. When I got serious about applying to American universities for my graduate work, Edward, recognizing my own love for literature and languages, helped me decide on Columbia by noting that its comparative literature program, founded in 1899, was the oldest in the US. This and other insights helped make up my mind. In late August 1986, my sister and I arrived in New York, still dazed and confused from the ongoing Lebanese civil war. And a few days later, I entered the offices of the Complete program at Columbia. The departmental assistant soon informed me that I already had a room waiting for me at the International House, the main off-campus residence for foreign students. Once there, at the reception desk, I was given a copy of my application for housing. And only then did I realize that Edward himself, not an assistant or a secretary, had filled it out and signed it on my behalf. Another manifestation of his genuine care for us as new arrivals came in the form of Majid Halawi, a doctoral student at Columbia, whom Edward had kindly asked to show us around campus and the neighborhood. Thanks to Edward's ceaseless efforts, in no time at all, I had a place, however tiny, that I could call home, as well as a Lebanese guide helping me around. These two factors were crucial in warding off the potential for homesickness and disorientation. Edward was instrumental in the transition period when, at 21, I was adapting to a whole new way of life. In summer of 1987, following my graduation with an MA, I toyed with the possibility of taking a year off and working in New York. I assumed that Edward would disagree and discourage me by arguing that such a break would make my re-entry into academic life, whether at Columbia or elsewhere, more difficult. To my surprise, he did not preach that I should continue my graduate studies no matter what. Instead, he said it was my decision, but cautioned that I shouldn't take more than 1 year off. True to his promise to help me again, this time ironically to facilitate my temporary departure from Columbia, he put me in contact with the editor of a journal for which I thought I could write. Despite receiving a job offer, I changed my mind. When I called Edward to inform him that I had decided to join the AMPL program without delay, he articulated a seemingly moderate approval of the move, but I could hear his wide smile crackling through the phone line. Had email been used at that time, I would have missed out on this precious auditory signal of his unconditional yet measured and wise support. In short, Edward never told me, or as far as I know any other student, what to do, what to think, or how to act. Instead, he hinted at how we should think. He encouraged us to decide for ourselves, with concrete help if need be, but more importantly, with subtle guidance, in order to eventually embark on more rewarding experiences, be they professional or academic. Edward as a teacher. I took 2 classes with Edward. One was an MA seminar in comparative literature, the other an MPhil seminar on cultural imperialism. The complete seminar had 20 students in it, and the room was on a high floor in the School of the International Affairs building. With a partial view of what Edward liked to call the capital of the world, he loved teaching in this room. 2 moments from this seminar will help illustrate Edward's unorthodox but memorable teaching style. One was the Michael Sullivan event. A quiet student by that name always sat at the same spot, but had not said anything since the beginning of the term. Halfway through the semester, Edward suddenly looked at him and asked, "Do I know you?" Michael was so flustered his glasses almost fell off his face. Of course, Edward did not mean to embarrass him, but it was his unique way of informing him in only 4 words that unless and until he had something to contribute to class discussions, that he would surely never make it into Edward's long-term memory. It worked. Edward's question had been rhetorical, and the correct answer lay far beyond a simple yes or a name on his class roster. Slowly but surely, Michael started participating. In so doing, he eventually answered Edward's provocative, but certainly well-intentioned question in the positive. The other incident was the Mark Wolfart event, which took place in that same class, but at the beginning of the semester. It involved a book by Georg Lukács, published in 1979, but whose title Edward could not recall. So he asked if anyone did. A student from Luxembourg who had just walked late into the seminar and was trying to make his way to an empty seat through the many knapsacks on the floor casually replied, "From Romanticism to Bolshevism." In this case, Edward's question was meant literally and answered both correctly and immediately. Edward was pleasantly surprised and exclaimed, "That's correct, and you are?" Unlike Michael, this student proudly announced his full name. Edward nodded smilingly. This smile, unlike the one over the phone line, was not only heard, but also seen, and by many. It was his way of saying, again without using too many words, that he would not be forgetting this particular young man anytime soon, because he had already made his mark, a first but lasting impression. Both of these incidents show that Edward truly admired knowledgeable and communicative students and encouraged the more silent types, those whose abilities shone more readily in writing, to be not only seen or read even, but also heard. Another memorable Edward moment came during the Cultural Imperialism seminar when I was asked to do an oral presentation on D.H. Lawrence's studies in classic American literature. Halfway through my report, while looking down at my notes, I heard Edward slam the conference table. My heart skipped several beats. I was sure I must have made an egregious error, or even worse, a stupid remark. As I looked up, barely able to breathe, I heard him announce, "That was a great point you just made." Needless to say, I have long forgotten what I had said, that he deemed worthy of being so loudly underscored, but I will always remember the sweet thud itself. Edward as a thesis advisor. Another edifying experience took place during my pre-oral exam. The topic was Orientalism. He asked me why I thought William Beckford had chosen the title Vatek for his late 18th century Gothic narrative. All I could think of on the spur of the moment was that Vatek sounds like Fatik in Arabic, i.e. the agent of the verb fataka in Arabic, which means to aggress against someone. And Vatek was surely a character who had become a bedeviled aggressor. Edward liked my spontaneous reply, saying that academics should not only spend hours pondering, but also be able to think on their feet. It was the first time I had heard the expression. And I looked at my feet. Again, indirectly, he taught me at that moment that creativity in literary criticism might start with a sound, a word, possibly across languages and cultures, before it grows into something bigger and by far more complex. He taught me to give primacy to the text, to see how it affects me and sends me off in different directions, instead of simply imposing on it a fixed view or a literary theory that might limit my own interpretive potential. In 1990, after passing my oral exam, I wrote up a tentative 5-page PhD prospectus with which I went to seek Edward's opinion. He put on his glasses and went through it. Barely 5 minutes later, he handed it back to me saying, "This is a rehash of your oral, Syrine. You can do much better than this." Feeling anxious and somewhat puzzled, I spent the next 2 days at home crying. On the third day, I started looking at the tables of contents of several books for help in reconceptualizing my own approach. And eureka! Simply by reshuffling my chapters, a whole new argument emerged. Little did I know at the time that those words, not perceived as being really helpful at that crucial moment in his office, would inspire a more interesting thesis, which would later be rewritten in book form. Conclusion. Synthesizing today my vivid memories of these and many other moments in my graduate life makes me see clearly how Edward Said was an illustrious example of what Thomas Carothers meant when he stated that a good teacher or a good educator in general is, quote, one who makes himself progressively unnecessary, end of quote, for any given student, group, or even a whole generation of learners and achievers. Edward was without a doubt more than a good teacher. He was, in one word, good. A good man and an excellent teacher, not for one course or one semester, nor one degree or even 3, but for life. Thank you very much.
Our speaker is Samir, Professor of Sociology
If I talk in class sitting down, my students will think there's something wrong with me. So I apologize for taking the podium. And being the last speaker, an episode comes to mind. I once attended Senator George Mitchell being the 9th speaker in a panel in New York. And I never forgot what he had to say. He said he imagined himself being the 9th husband of Elizabeth Taylor. He knew exactly what to do, but he didn't know how to make it interesting. So after... So I don't know how I hear it, but following my colleagues, I have known 4 Edwards at different 4 moments in his life, and they became progressively more as the time of his death approached. First, I knew him in the early 1960s, in the summers. He lived in Tour Shwayr, I lived in Alay, and we were both working on our PhD theses. I discovered yesterday when I was looking at his resume that he finished the same year I finished, in 1964. But he always had snide remarks to make about my Princeton background, let alone that he himself was a Princeton graduate. But he had a thing about Princeton men, because Bernard Lewis, Michael Walzer, Morrow Berger, even sometimes Charles Isawi came to mind, and these were the people he was combating with for much of his life. But the second Edward was when I was taking a leave in 1973-74 in Harvard. He also had taken a leave from Columbia to Harvard. And he would walk in. We lived in Quincy House, Rosanna and I, and he would walk in occasionally during lunch with his favorite sandwiches. That's one of 2, either a pastrami sandwich, very huge, or a Reuben sandwich. And he would finish it in less than a few seconds. And he, at that time, had begun working on, of course, Orientalism. And then he would look at me and say, "Tell your friends in Princeton that they will hear from me." And soon enough, he was telling me my book is going to be a splash. Obviously, his book became more than just a flash. Then, from 1984 until 1995, I was on an extended leave at Princeton, and we saw each other more often. I often acted as his partner when he went for his chemo sessions in the hospital. When I was leaving to Lebanon in 1995, I told Edward, "Would you like to come and give a lecture?" He says, "What?" And he was very cynical. He says, "I always hear this from my Arab colleagues and Arab friends, and that's the end of it. As you know, I've been virtually in every corner of the world, but I have yet to give a lecture in any country in the Arab world." So I knew exactly what I wanted to do. The moment I got to Beirut, I sent him an official letter. At that time, we had Mellon funding. And this is where I discovered the 4th Edward, the Edward that Jean described so admirably. He was stunned. We were all stunned by the reception. Students will be sitting on the floor. There will be more people outside the Issam Faris Hall than inside. In addition to the 5 or 6 lectures he gave, there were 2 moments that I think are very memorable. Elias, Fawwaz, and myself made a tribute where over 30 Arab scholars, both from the region, from abroad, came and talked. And his reaction was almost like an Orientalism in reverse. You know, he didn't think that we are capable of hosting an event of this sort, you know. And the more memorable moment, and all of us were here, is the moment after his death. What we decided to do at that time, that each of us, rather than talking for 10 or 15 minutes and never making it, we would recite some favorable passage from his writing. The people inside, the people outside the hall were again stunning. So in thinking about what I want to do here today, just what can I do that I do not have to repeat myself or repeat what my colleagues have already said. Yesterday, while I ran into Nader, a thought came to me because there was a book edited by Vijay, one of his students, Power, Politics, and Culture, which combines all his interviews. And after going through the book, I discovered there's an Edward in the interviews that does not appear in his written essays, in his written texts and books. And I want to focus on a few, because if I were to list his accomplishments, it will take me time. By the way, already Orientalism has 30 languages. All the anthologies, all the PhDs that have been done about him, the 4 handsome Sage volumes, all these, in fact, the material on him has become something of a growth industry. And I wonder what would have happened to Edward had he been with us today. So what can I say in the few minutes I still have by way of elucidating this contrapuntal approach in his writing and his life that Edward represents? Throughout his interviews, one captures Edward in an engaging mode which is not as visible in his written text. They are his own on-the-spot reflections, often rambling, often discursive, at times prosaic, in the best meaning of the word, but they are almost always suffused with vintage Edward, the erudite, essayist, the sporty and playful, but never muddle-headed or perplexed. Typically, one sees Edward rushing in, as the song says, where angels feared to tread. He never admired fools gladly. He was never reticent about them. He always disclosed their foibles and pitfalls. He delighted in a good fight and always resolute and combative. Altogether, the interviews constitute to me a sustained act of discovery and a formal and compelling voice. Like elsewhere, one finds 3 Edwards: Edward speaking up, Edward speaking out, and Edward speaking for the people who thought were voiceless and cannot express their angst. One learns much from the interviews, and not only justifying why and what he's doing, but one also begins to prefigure and anticipate what comes ahead. Let me quote a few passages here. He's talking about cities, and he always moves and leaps from the prosaic, empirical to projecting some paradigm, some perspective or vision about history, society, and culture in general. What I'm really trying to say, he says, is that there is a peculiar paradox in a city, at once a great metropolitan center, a great alternative site, 2 things. 1, to the powerful contained interests of the metropolitan West in the Orient, and 2, Alexandria, the Levantine city par excellence. And yet, more impressively, Cairo is a city that doesn't force upon you some sort of already existing totality. In other words, there is certain relaxation in the idea of Cairo, at least the way I've gradually grasped it, which makes it possible for all manner of identities to exist unhurriedly within the whole. The idea is an indistinct one, but you can actually experience it. All kinds of histories, narratives, and pressures intersect, coexist in what I suggest is a natural way. For me, that defines the pleasurably urban, not Paris, the vigorously planned city as an imperial center, nor London with its carefully displayed monumentality, but rather a city providing a relaxed interchange between various incomplete, partially destroyed histories that still exist and partially do not. He's just talking, and see how his ideas flow from the prosaic to Cairo requires, he tells it, a certain effort of reconstruction. I'll give you further examples, but I'm not going to extend on that. Let me identify briefly just a few of the bewildering anomalies and contradictions in his life. 2 minutes. I have 2 minutes. I skipped much. That's very important at the end. When he was asked which of the three roles, a writer, a teacher, an activist, he feels most comfortable with, his answer was very revealing. I think that of a teacher. I've been teaching now for almost 40 years, and I've always learned during the actual class there is something that eludes me when I read and think without the presence of students. So I've always thought of my classes as not a routine to go through, but rather an experience of investigation and discovery. And I depend very heavily on reactions from my students. In early days, when I started teaching, I used to over-prepare, plan every second and every class. Later, because I had such an exceptional students at Columbia, I found that students' comments would stimulate lines of thought and discussion that I would expected before. And very often that found its way into my own writing. He goes on in other interviews to elaborate on the nature of discipleship. He was very much concerned about that. And I'll conclude. There's one point I want to go back to, which I forgot to mention. The idea of the anti-dynastic intellectual is very important to me. The anti-dynastic intellectual. To tell you the honest truth, that's a especially important point for me, because ever since I was a student, I was aware of the whole question of discipleship, which is fascinating because being a student of someone and then being a teacher of somebody, that kind of relationship is replicated not only in our lives at the university, but even before that when we are students. I have always had a very complicated feeling about this because I don't like to be thought of as somebody else's person in the first instance. And in the second instance, I don't want anybody to be my person. In other words, I have a great deal of the question of doing something for oneself. It's a form of independence, I suppose, which A, I cherish, and B, I don't think the kinds of works I write, like this book on Orientalism or any other things that I have written, I don't think they derive from formulas or concepts that can be handed on. They really derive from personal experience, and that's something terribly important to me. Let me end up with an epigram I want to use on a chapter I've written to Edward, on Edward. The sense of being between cultures has been very, very strong for me. I would say that's the simple, strongest strand running through my life. The fact that I'm always in and out of things and never really of anything for very long. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this stimulating, inspiring panel. I felt that your words, in a sense, generate the space in which Edward present. We have some time for the panelists to engage in some further conversation, perhaps some remarks on each other's presentation, and then after that we will open the session for questions and comments from the audience. Well, perhaps I'll just ask you if you have further things to share with us, Jean.
I admired what my colleague said. I think it was very moving and very stimulating as well. I don't need this. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Khalaf. No, that's.
I just thought of the story of Abbal Ahmad's visit to Beirut and the meeting with Faiz Ahmad Faiz. It happened that I met them there, and I think the impact of Faiz Ahmad Faiz as a poet on us here in Beirut, and then his this kind of humanistic approach, very, very profound humanistic approach, was very inspiring to all of us. And I remember his meetings with us, with Mahmoud Darwish and with myself, and then when Iqbal and Edward came, how rich it was. So I think here we go beyond being between cultures. This is one culture. There is a culture. There is one culture now, which is being developed through decades, which is the culture of resistance, and which we'll find everywhere in the world. And in this sense, Faiz Ahmad Faiz is our comrade and our friend and our colleague.
Mr. Makdisi talked about Edward's control over language, and this is to confirm what she said. John Bailey, a great critic of Oxford, wrote an article in that year, lesson 1982, and said, in connection with post-structuralism, and said that Edward Said invented a new English language. Another, just one example on Edward's great sense of humor. The last lecture he gave at the AUC, someone came up with a question, I think he was about the brother, and said, tell us about your relationship with God. And he said, well, you seem to have missed my specialty. I am a comparative literature man. And if you ask me about this, I can answer you. Yes, I agree that his sense of humor is Sufyan. But in the course of talking about a PLO member who talks Arabic, eloquently, but very pedantic. So I said, well, what do you think of his great eloquence? He said, he dreams in colloquial Arabic and talks in classical Arabic.
I just want to comment about what Said-Makdisi said, because I was at that lecture, and it felt like going to see a rock star, and we just couldn't believe our luck, and we got angry at every stupid question because it was 5 minutes less with Edward Said, and wanted to just hear him say, and wanted to converse with him. What I want to say is that Edward gave us pride. We were proud. He reminded us that our struggle, being Palestinian or Arab, was an honorable one, because the propaganda in the States wants us to believe that it is a dishonorable one, and that only a certain people suffered, and everybody else is extra. We are the Jews. That is true. The struggle is ours. What fascinates me about him is, even though he was a young man in 1967, He never fell into the trap that every one of us did, which tried to fit in, reduce our Arabness, extend our bluntness, wanting to be not controversial. He stood there, handsome and tall, and reminded them that being Arab is good. What we're struggling for is honorable, and not to be shy, and to be modern at the same time, to be secular, to be part of life. But our struggle is as worthy as any, and never to let go. And I thank him for that. I always thought, even about his parents, how did they do it? How did they bring him up like that? Because we're tempted still. But all the children they had. So, and he was handsome. And you are very beautiful too. So it added to our pride. We really looked up to him.
Since this is a conference, let's say, about the legacy of Edward Said, in the afterword of his book, Orientalism, he spoke about the absence of the critical appreciation of his conceptual tools that he offered in Orientalism in the Arab world, unlike the case in, let's say, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. After something like, around 10 years after his death, do you think that there has been any works that appreciated the conceptual tools that Edward Said offered in Orientalism in the Arab world? That's an open question to the panel, so I will.
Well, the question is, and it's a large question, and it is, how much is Edward read, and what is read by Edward in the Arab world? Unfortunately, very little. And then, so I mean, as far as we could make, when at the occasion of his death, we went around a few Arab countries and heard many people speak. First, there is his political writings in Al-Hayat. Then there is Orientalism, or what is known about Orientalism, the book, I mean. What I was trying to say in my brief talk is that, unfortunately, not only in the Arab world, but elsewhere, two phases of Edward Said are very little known. His critique, his culture and imperialism phase. Even his self-criticism about Orientalism. You know, Edward revised in his own way a lot of the things about the book Orientalism. And lastly, his secular humanism, which is abolished in the name of being politically, Edward is politically correct vis-a-vis Islam. Edward was a very staunch secular humanist, whether we like it or not. I'm talking about writings, not only about personality. So I know, I mean, having translated 2 of his books, Muhammad also, I know that a translated book in Beirut usually produces 3,000, 4,000 books. His autobiography was until now not republished. There was no second edition of his Out of Place, unless of course editors do the same trick that we know and produce additional versions without telling the author or the translator. But I mean, one of the things that I think was taken from Edward and dominated is the one I was warning against, which is first to accept that there is East and West and that there are 2 essences. Second, I think I call it the ideology of cultural and social parvenus who are always telling the West, we are not like that. Which is, we are against how we are represented. What I wanted to say, and I mean, my discussion with friends who emphasize this part of Edward, is first to remind that Edward is a critic of identitarian politics, though he's being hijacked into identitarian politics. He's a very severe critic of nationalism in the sense, not in the sense of that's current in academia, but in the sense of being exactly an identitarian outlook on life. In his last book, which to my mind is his masterpiece, which is On Late Style, and his late style, this is his, he quotes, talking about Genet, he emphasizes, for him, identitarianism is an imperialist product. Identitarianism is not what you answer imperialism with. This is why I was saying, if we're interested in anything from Edward, let's produce knowledge first about ourselves, and let's produce knowledge about what imperialism is, so that the study of imperialism will become history and not representation.
ممتاز. ممتاز. أحسنت أستاذ.
Thank you. Professor Traboulsi, would you not consider, though, that precisely this act of producing knowledge about ourselves, the kind of epistemological exercise itself, which is what Edward Said, I think, is criticizing in Orientalism, is an act of identitarianism, is a type of reproducing another Arab or another Orient that is different, perhaps, than that we take issue with by Orientalists? And my second question to Professor Khoury, and I guess in some way the whole talks of this panel, there is this intellectual that for sure Edward Said was. He was a secular humanist, etc. All of this is definitely there and present in his writings. But I was thinking as well about the classic Islamic intellectual, the alim, who was organic in every sense of the word, and at the same time spoke truth to power and aligned themselves with power in different ways. How does this figure feature in what you described as this sort of period or this Arab Spring period in which we live, where the secular intellectual has been muffled or silenced by precisely these Islamist voices? I was wondering if you could speak to that as well, please. Thank you.
Actually, when you were asking your question, I was thinking of a very close friend and great Egyptian intellectual, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid. And Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid was an Islamist, and actually he began his life as part of the clergy establishment in Egypt before he left. And I was thinking how much Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid was in exile inside this country. So when I was speaking about this kind of intellectuals, we must not only see the dominant, what is the television intellectuals, يعني Qaradawi and all these type of Wahhabist Islam, which is financed by the petrodollar. We have to think about real ulama who are really marginalized. If you think about Lebanon, for example, and about the Shia ulama, someone like Muhammad Hassan al-Amin, who is totally marginalized. He's more marginalized than Fawwaz Traboulsi, even. I thought that Fawwaz will be, Fawwaz or myself will be the ultimate marginalized intellectuals. To find that someone like Sheikh Muhammad Hassan al-Amin or like Hani Fahas are even more marginalized than we are. So actually, it's not a matter of being secular or not. It's a matter of how the establishment, the power structure, how the power structure is using culture or is using religion now in order to make its hegemony, and how this is resisted. And in this sense, I think that someone like Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid or Muhammad Hassan al-Amin can be categorized in the Saidian typology as secular intellectuals, even though they are religious, in the sense that they are dealing with the problems of society through the tools of knowledge, and not only through the religious or given tools to be religious tools. So here we are in the same place. I mean, and I don't think the problem is here. The problem is not with religion. The problem is with the power structure, with the power dominant structure in the Arab world. If you speak about Lebanon, the power structure, the confessional power structure, which is making from us tools in the hands of stupid confessional structures that have nothing to do neither with the idea of the state itself. Actually, they are destroying, as I said, that this type of power is the enemy of the state, which means it's the enemy of society. And here lies our feeling of being marginalized, or our feeling of exile.
Yes, if you permit me, I'm astonished to hear you describe yourself and Fawwaz as marginalized. I mean, you're surely scarcely marginal to intellectual life in this part of the world. No, well, why marginalized? I mean, what is your definition of marginalized? You mean in terms of political power, but not in terms of, not as intellectuals? I mean, are you saying the intellectual has to have political power, or there's no separation between the two? I'm not sure about this.
I mean, yes, can answer himself, but I think what he meant, and I agree with him, has a bit to do with what Vijay was saying. Marginalized in the sense that we are no more part of a current, which is both political and cultural, and which is engaged in real battles in the region. Yes, in that sense, we are marginalized. If the choice is between jihadis and askars, and we do belong to a minority in the Arab world, which easily says no to both, which politically has no meaning. I mean, at least where dominant trends would laugh at you. What do you mean? You're against Saddam Hussein and against the American invasion of Syria. You were against and the American invasion of Iraq. You're against Bashar al-Assad, and you're against the American invasion of Syria. So in that sense, yes, I mean, we are individuals in a sense cut off from a tradition which has gone elsewhere. But this doesn't mean we are no less stubborn and militant, if I may speak in both our names.
Just one thing. Being marginal does not mean being not important. We are very important. I'm not joking. But we have to define what's marginal, even in culture we are marginal, in the sense that we have to define culture. This dominant Lebanese culture, where we live, we are totally outsiders. We are a small group, I mean, of people, and we do not have access, actually. Actually, we are kicked out. Anyway, you cannot go to the Lebanese televisions, not only because we are kicked out, but technically we cannot go there, because what to do there? You have to sit with whom? So actually, and here I think that Edward Said himself, in this sense, in the last 10 years of his life, he was forbidden from publishing in the New York Times, and from American television. It was an act of trying to marginalize him in this sense. I'm not speaking about importance, of course. Yeah, we are not good, let's say, not bad writers, and not bad writers. And Fawwaz is a great writer.
I think that Edward, sorry, Vijay, go. No, please. I know that Edward, in the last years of his life, refused many television interviews and many radio interviews. And I know certainly one of the very last times I saw him, we were in Cambridge, in London, and I think the BBC was, remember Samir? The BBC was trying to get an interview with him, and he categorically refused. I mean, it's not so much that they didn't want him as he didn't want them. He just said, I've had enough of the hectoring. I mean, he used that word hectoring all the time. I've had enough of the hectoring. I've had enough of these stupid arguments. I've had enough of being asked these leading questions like, what do you think of the latest terrorist attack or something like, which they always began with. And he was fed up with that kind of thing. I think it had some, really I do think, and I said this of course when I was talking, that I really do think he got worn out at the end. He was physically tired. And I think this kind of thing tired him even more. I mean, this constant attack that he was under really, really tired him. And I think, I really believe he would have lived a lot longer had he not had to deal with that. But I think to come back to you, Elias, if I may, just for a second, to say that I mean, what about all these millions of people in Egypt and Tunis who are fighting against both the Islamists and the military? I mean, why do you not see yourselves in alliance with them? I find that, okay, so not so marginal after all.
I'd like to just come outside because this is your conversation, not mine directly. There's an American poet, I forgot, maybe Patrick or Alex will remember, Muriel Rukeyser. She has a great line. She talks of left intellectuals as being exiles from the future. You know, that should be the attitude of the left intellectual, that we are most at home in the future, that this is a miserable place to be. And it is indeed the case that it's very rare for left intellectuals to have the comfort of the tide of history go your way. So if you just go back 15 years to Latin America, that was a miserable place to be a left intellectual. And then the tide of history turns through popular struggle, breakthroughs happen in certain places, and the left is buoyant, and intellectualism moves ahead. I mean, I think sometimes we as intellectuals forget how much we are reliant on the force of history, and how much we are parasitic on historical circumstance. I mean, it's perfectly true that today, I'm speaking now out of turn, it's perfectly true that there is a majority even perhaps in this region, in most of the world, that is saying neither this nor that. Whether it's in Greece, whether it's in, in the Indignados movement in Spain, neither this nor that. Not this, not that. We don't want either. There is, I think, a majority in the world that wants something different. But it's not a political project yet. And until it's a political project, I think intellectuals feel marginalized even from it. Because we have not been able to produce not only the concepts for it, but certainly not its organizational form. And that has not been imagined. And until those two things are imagined, I feel the organizational form, the concepts, how do we articulate with that? It only becomes romance then. And therefore, even though I belong to a very large political organization, even though I belong to a world where there's enormous political fights and resilience, even I feel a sense of marginality from the whole world. Because the planet has gone in this direction, and human beings are going somewhere else.
May I answer the question about what does it mean to produce knowledge about, not self, about the region and about Islam. But first, I want to emphasize, Vijay, we are not complaining. We like
marginality.
I was not complaining. I think Edward, at the end of Orientalism, said one thing. The important thing is that Orientals do not get Orientalized. To my mind, I mean, that's a quote. To my mind, this is the mission I'm talking about. If you don't want to get Orientalized, you have to produce counter-knowledge. You don't spend your time criticizing Orientalism. And I am, without exaggeration, I think a lot of intellectual efforts, a lot of scientific effort, a lot of efforts in the humanities and the social sciences, not to speak of the media, is geared at this aspect of discourse analysis of the other. So what I mean, take one example, Samir would know it. Sociology, for the past 10 years, at least I've attended colloquiums of Arab sociologists. Out of 15 papers I had to comment on, 10 were about representation. Yani one was about, more than one, was about the veil, and everything about the veil was discussed, except the fact that it was supposed to hide the hair. Let's be candid about how much symbolism and representation. That's not Edward. That's everybody. Controlled intellectual production. So I mean, Edward was not interested. It wasn't his business to produce knowledge on the region. He was battling on a different cultural and political front. But he did criticize representations of the West when his position on Oslo is a position on how a Palestinian leadership, how a national leadership dealt with the enemy, whatever you want to call it, with the adversary. So that is what I meant. I'm not talking about producing knowledge about the self in a subjective manner. I'm talking about producing knowledge about this region where we live and about Islam. We defend Islam. We rarely produce knowledge about Islam. Those who produce knowledge about Islam are not very well considered, as Elias was talking about somebody like anybody, Khalil Abdul Karim, Mahmoud Shahrur, whoever tries to deal with Islam historically, with Islam. We should teach religions. I mean, as simply as that. We don't teach religions. So we have this instinct of defending whatever is here because it has been attacked or criticized elsewhere. But this is what I think Edward is saying, beware this. Sorry for taking too much.
Thank you. We take one more question or comment. So